The hit squad, the Black Radius, hadn't just broken in. They had been invited by the digital equivalent of an open door. The metadata on the file was even more damning. The schedules had been modified and uploaded from an encrypted account tied to the estate's own primary security administrator, the very person responsible for Jaden's safety. Saad leaned over the console, the blue light of the screens reflecting in her wide, shocked eyes. She realized that the men in black tactical gear weren't just fighting the security team. They were working on a script provided by one of them. The military precision she had admired from the basement wasn't just skill. It was a pre-rehearsed performance based on stolen intimacy. A sudden movement on the monitor for the East Wing caught her eye. Two attackers were bypassing the main security locks using a set of override codes that shouldn't have existed. They were heading for the server room, intending to wipe the very evidence she was now holding. Saad looked at Jaden, then back at the flashing data on the screen. The secret of who had betrayed the Cole family was no longer buried in the rubble. It was in her hands. If she failed now, the truth would die with her, and Jaden would be left in the care of the monsters who had sold him out. She felt a new kind of steel hardening in her chest, one that had nothing to do with her domestic role and everything to do with her father's legacy. She reached for a tablet, syncing the evidence to a remote drive her father had set up for her years ago, a digital lifeboat for a cartel princess in hiding. "I see you," she whispered to the shadows on the screen, her voice low and dangerous. "And now I know exactly who you are." Saad watched the monitors as the two mercenaries from Black Radius approached the server room doors, their movements fluid and predatory in the blue light of the security hub. She knew that if they reached the physical drives, her leverage and the evidence of the betrayal would be erased forever. Her shoulder throbbed with a dull, rhythmic heat, but the floating sensation of absolute focus had taken over, the trauma-born clarity her father had called the hunter's eye. She looked at Jaden, who was huddled on the sofa with his eyes closed, and she knew she couldn't just hide anymore. She had to fight back using the only tools she had, the mansion's own intelligence. Her fingers danced over the touchscreen console. For months, she had been the invisible ghost cleaning these monitors, noticing how the high-tech systems were integrated into a single, vulnerable network. She navigated to the environmental controls, the lighting, the climate, and the fire suppression protocols. The hit squad was geared for a standard tactical engagement. They were equipped with high-end thermal imaging and night vision, technology that relied on consistent environmental data. "I'm going to make them blind, Jaden," she whispered, her voice tight but certain. She initiated a manual override of the mansion's lighting grid. In a synchronized burst of digital commands, she triggered the strobe emergency mode in the East Wing. The hallway outside the server room was suddenly swallowed by a violent, high-frequency flickering of 10,000 lumen LEDs. Through the cameras, she saw the two attackers stagger, their night vision goggles instantly overwhelmed by the sudden wall of white light, turning their vision into a useless kaleidoscope of glare. But she wasn't done. While they were disoriented, Saad triggered the fire suppression system. Instead of water, the ceiling vents hissed open to release a thick, pressurized cloud of chemical foam and halon gas. The hallway transformed into a toxic white soup in seconds. On her monitors, the mercenaries' thermal signatures began to blur and bleed into the surrounding environment as the cold gas neutralized the heat signatures they relied on to track movement. She watched them through the low-light filters, seeing the professional killers reduced to stumbling shadows. They were coughing, their military precision shattered by a woman who knew the signature of violence better than they did. One of them fired blindly into the foam, the muzzle flash of his weapon a dull, useless orange spark in the white haze. Saad felt a surge of cold satisfaction. She was outsmarting the elite, using the very blind spots they had ignored because they didn't think a maid could understand the board. She reached for the intercom system, her voice dropping into the low, steady tone of a commander. "You're in my house now," she whispered into the mic, her words echoing through the smoke-filled hallway above. "And I see every move you make." The attackers froze, their heads pivoting toward the ceiling speakers in a moment of genuine, unfiltered fear. They realized then that they weren't fighting the scrambled security team or the Winter Dragon's lieutenants. They were fighting a ghost who controlled the very air they breathed. Saad leaned back against the console, her hands shaking but her resolve unbroken. The trap was set, the professionals were blinded, and the invisible woman had just taken control of the war. The blue-lit sanctuary of the security hub felt like a tomb as the heavy steel doors groaned under the weight of a physical assault from the outside. Saad knew the halon gas and strobe lights had only bought them minutes. The lead mercenary of Black Radius, a man who moved with a terrifying, predatory grace, had bypassed the environmental chaos and was now methodically cutting through the safe room's secondary locks. She looked at Jaden, who was curled into a tight, trembling ball, his small hands still clutching the fabric of her uniform, as if she were the only solid thing left in a dissolving universe. There were no more cameras to watch, no more digital traps to spring. The war had narrowed down to a single room and a single choice. "Jaden, listen to me," she whispered, her voice a calm, unbreakable thread amidst the screeching of metal on metal. "When I open the service lift, you climb in. You don't make a sound until you see the light from the garden. Do you understand?" The boy nodded, his eyes wide and wet with a terror that no 6-year-old should ever know. Saad ushered him into the small, wood-paneled dumbwaiter, the same one she had used every morning to send up breakfast trays, and watched as he disappeared into the dark shaft. She was alone now, the invisible help, standing in the wreckage of a high-tech empire. The safe room door shook one last time and hissed open. The lead mercenary stepped through the smoke, his black tactical gear shredded and stained with foam, his movements cold and efficient. He didn't look like a man. He looked like a machine designed for the singular purpose of ending lives. His automatic weapon swept the room, but Saad was already moving. She didn't have a rifle or a tactical vest, but she had the tool she had carried in her apron for 8 months. A heavy, industrial-grade floor scraper, its steel blade sharpened to a razor edge from months of removing stubborn wax from the marble. He saw her then, a young black woman in a black and white uniform, and for a split second, his professional mask slipped. He saw a maid, a non-combatant, a servant. It was the same mistake her father's killers had made in Lagos, the mistake of assuming that those who serve are also those who are weak. Saad didn't wait for him to adjust his aim. She lunged, not for his chest, but for the gap in his tactical vest she had identified while watching him on the monitors. As he raised his weapon, Saad swung the heavy scraper with a desperate, two-handed force, the metal blade catching the barrel of his rifle and shunting the muzzle flash into the ceiling. The roar of the gunfire was deafening in the small space, but she was already inside his reach. She used the weight of the tool like a lever, jamming the steel blade into the joint of his knee and twisting with every ounce of her strength. The mercenary buckled, a guttural sound of shock escaping his throat as his leg gave way. He tried to draw a sidearm, but Saad was a blur of motion, her body moving on the pure, visceral instinct her father had called the survivor's dance. She struck again, the heavy handle of the scraper connecting with the base of his skull, sending him sprawling across the blood-slicked floor. The professional killer lay still, neutralized not by a military-grade weapon, but by the very tool used to maintain the house he had tried to destroy. Saad stood over him, her chest heaving, her uniform torn and soaked with a mixture of sweat and blood. She looked down at the floor scraper, the simple servant's tool that had just ended the career of an elite mercenary. She wasn't just a maid anymore, and she wasn't just a witness. She was the woman who had held the line when the world went dark. The sirens of the elite response units were a distant, wailing background to the ringing silence in Sada's ears. She stood in the center of the shattered security hub, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches that rattled against her bruised ribs. The lead mercenary lay at her feet, a mountain of high-tech gear and tactical efficiency brought down by the simple, heavy steel of a floor scraper. Her black and white uniform was no longer neat. It was torn at the shoulder where the bullet had grazed her, and the white apron was stained with a mixture of plaster dust and the dark, spreading evidence of her own survival. The air in the hallway outside suddenly shifted, a heavy, freezing presence that signaled the arrival of something far more dangerous than the men who had breached the gates. Hyen-Woo Park, the man the underworld called the Winter Dragon, moved through the smoke of the ruined mansion with a terrifying, sharp-edged speed. He didn't look like the cold, calculating CEO Saad had spent 8 months avoiding. He looked like a demon unleashed, his dark eyes sweeping the carnage with a gaze that found the worth of everything and usually found it wanting. He came to a dead stop at the threshold of the safe room, his right-hand man, June, halting behind him with a weapon still raised. Hyen Wu didn't look at the neutralized mercenary on the floor. He didn't look at the destroyed high-tech monitors. His eyes locked onto Saad, and for the first time in the 8 months she had worked in his home, he really looked at her. He saw the trembling in her hands, the blood soaking through her sleeve, and the way she stood between him and the service lift where she had hidden his son. Where is he? Hyen Wu's voice was breaking, a sound of raw, unpolished terror that he had likely never made in his 35 years of life. Saad couldn't find her voice, her throat tight with the aftershocks of the fight, but she gestured toward the dumbwaiter. Hyen Wu moved with a desperation that shattered his icy composure, sliding across the blood-slicked marble to wrench open the small wooden door. "Daddy!" Jaden's voice was a high-pitched sob of pure relief as he tumbled out of the darkness and into his father's arms. Hyen Wu held the boy with an intensity that suggested the child might disappear if he loosened his grip even slightly. He buried his face in Jaden's hair, his shoulders shaking with a breath he hadn't taken since the first explosion rocked the estate. After a long, silent moment, he looked up, his thumb moving unconsciously across Jaden's knuckles in small circles as he stared at the woman standing over his enemies. He remembered her name now. He saw the precise way she had positioned herself to protect the boy, the way she had calculated the angles and the blind spots. He saw the scars on her hands. Maid's hands, calloused from hard work, but hands that had saved everything that mattered to him. "You're not just a maid," he said quietly, his voice flat with a sudden, dawning realization. "You assessed the threat. You outmaneuvered them." Saad wiped a smudge of soot from her forehead, her posture finally beginning to slump as the adrenaline drained away. "I saw the danger before it saw us, Mr. Park," she whispered, her voice a hollow echo of her father's lessons. "It's the only way people like us survive." Hyen Wu stood up, still holding Jaden, and walked toward her. He didn't see the help or a foreign girl struggling with his language. He saw a woman who had been forged in the same fire that had forged him, a survivor who understood violence and sacrifice. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the fabric of her ruined uniform. "You took bullets for my heir," he murmured, his dark eyes intense and irreversible. "That is a debt that transcends money. That is a blood debt." Saad looked into the eyes of the winter dragon and realized that the invisible servitude she had occupied was gone. She had stepped through a door she could never close again. She was no longer just the maid who cleaned the floors. She was the woman who had held his world together while it was falling apart, and in the cold, blue light of the security hub, the power balance of the mansion shifted forever. The aftermath of the assault left the Cole estate in a state of fractured silence. But for Saad, the invisible life she had built was the first thing to be cleared away. 2 days after the breach, she stood not in the kitchen, but in Hyen Wu's private study, a room of dark wood and leather that she had previously only seen while polishing its surfaces. She was no longer wearing the black and white uniform. Instead, she wore a sharp, tailored suit that felt like a secondary skin, a suit designed for someone who commanded a room rather than cleaned it. Hyen Wu sat behind his desk, reviewing the digital evidence Saad had salvaged from the security hub. The files she had recovered had already led to a brutal purge within the organization. The head of security, the man who had sold Jaden's schedule to Black Radius, was gone. His betrayal met with the cold efficiency the Winter Dragon was known for. "The professionals I hired to protect my son failed because they relied on a contract," Hyen Wu said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant tone as he looked up at her. "You succeeded because you relied on something they don't understand. Loyalty that isn't for sale." He stood and walked toward the window, looking out over the gardens where Jaden was playing under the watchful eye of a new, vetted security detail. He turned back to Saad, his expression softening with a rare, genuine respect. "I'm restructuring everything. I don't want a team that just follows a schedule. I want someone who sees the blind spots. Someone who knows how to survive our world. He slid a document across the desk, a formal appointment elevating Saad Adebayo to the head of estate security. It was a position that carried more power than she had ever dreamed of, a role that recognized her not as the help, but as the ultimate protector of the Cole legacy. You saved my heir, Saad. That makes you family, he stated, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a promise that was both a shield and a debt. In this house, you will never be invisible again. Saad looked at the document, then out at Jaden, who caught her eye and waved with a joyful, innocent enthusiasm. She realized then that her father's lessons from Lagos hadn't just been about surviving violence. They were about finding a place where her strength would finally be seen. She reached out and signed the paper, her hands steady and certain. The maid had left the mansion, and in her place stood a warrior who had proven that in a world of professional killers, the most dangerous person is the one who has everything to lose.